It reportedly happened behind the carved oak doors of Clarence House just moments before sunset. Prince Edward, long regarded as the monarchy's quietest loyalist, finally raised his voice against King Charles. Courtiers froze. Advisors exchanged nervous glances. And at the center of the dispute stood Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose future role inside the monarchy had suddenly become the subject of a bitter royal divide no one saw coming. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Prince Edward had earned a reputation unlike any other senior royal. He was the dependable one, the restrained one, the man who rarely complained, rarely leaked frustration, and never allowed palace tensions to spill into public view. While other members of the royal family became trapped in scandals, interviews, memoirs, and bitter public disputes, Edward remained firmly in the shadows beside Sophie, carrying out thousands of engagements with almost military discipline, which is precisely why insiders now claim this private confrontation stunned even the most experienced palace staff. According to several reports, orts circulating within royal circles, King Charles had allegedly approved a proposal tied to the monarchy's long-discussed restructuring plans that would quietly reduce Sophie's ceremonial responsibilities over the next year. On paper, the adjustment appeared procedural, streamlined, administrative, but behind palace walls, different interpretations of the meeting describe something far more personal unfolding beneath the surface. Sources familiar with internal royal operations suggest Sophie had become increasingly indispensable during Charles's ongoing health struggles since early 2024. As the king stepped back from multiple public duties amid cancer treatment, Sophie allegedly absorbed a growing number of responsibilities without complaint or public recognition. Diplomatic receptions, Commonwealth meetings, military ceremonies. Private audiences that once would have fallen directly under the king's supervision reportedly began landing on her schedule instead. Palace aides quietly referred to her as one of the institution's most trusted operational royals. And yet, despite that loyalty, whispers had reportedly been building for months that Charles's senior advisors were revisiting the concept of a slimmed-down monarchy with renewed urgency. At first, many inside the palace dismissed those discussions as routine strategy meetings. After all, Charles had advocated for a more compact royal structure for decades. But according to insiders, the atmosphere changed dramatically once Sophie's name appeared on internal briefing documents connected to future role reductions. Staff members allegedly received unusually strict instructions not to discuss restructuring conversations outside private offices. One former palace insider reportedly described the mood as tense, cautious, almost rehearsed. Another claimed certain aides appeared terrified that details might leak before the king finalized his decisions. And through it all, Sophie reportedly continued carrying out public duties with calm professionalism, even as pressure quietly mounted behind closed doors. But the deeper this story goes, the more unsettling the timeline becomes, because reports suggest Edward had already grown increasingly frustrated long before this explosive meeting ever occurred. Observers had noticed subtle signs for weeks. His expressions during recent ceremonies appeared noticeable, colder. Several scheduled appearances involving senior royals were allegedly adjusted at the last minute without explanation. Meanwhile, Sophie herself maintained complete silence, fueling even more speculation that internal tensions were becoming impossible to contain. According to palace administrative whispers, Edward believed the proposed changes represented something far more dangerous than a simple restructuring effort. To him, this was about loyalty, sacrifice, duty. Sophie had reportedly stepped forward during one of the monarchy's most fragile modern periods, only to now face the possibility of being quietly sidelined once the institution regained stability. And that belief may explain why the usually composed Duke of Edinburgh reportedly reacted with visible emotion during the Clarence House discussion. Multiple insiders describe Edward as visibly disturbed after hearing the proposal outlined in detail. One palace source even claimed his response caught Charles completely off guard, because for perhaps the first time in years, Edward allegedly stopped behaving like the monarchy's silent supporter and began speaking like a man defending his family's place within the crown itself. Yet even as tensions escalated inside those private rooms, another troubling realization slowly emerged among palace insiders. This disagreement was no longer simply about schedules, patronages, or ceremonial appearances. Something larger was taking shape beneath the surface, a battle over relevance, influence, and the future balance of power inside a monarchy already under extraordinary strain. But insiders claim this disagreement was never only about Sophie's title, it was about who would control the monarchy's future once Charles could no longer hold it together. While headlines focused on William and Catherine, another royal was quietly carrying the burden of the crown behind the scenes. Sophie had become the monarchy's dependable shadow operator, gracious, disciplined, and relentlessly loyal. Yet according to palace whispers, her growing influence may have unsettled more people inside the royal machine than anyone realized. For much of the past decade, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, occupied a strange and often underestimated position within the royal family. She was never the loudest figure, never the most photographed, never the royal dominating newspaper covers, or sparking international debates. And perhaps that was precisely why she became so valuable to the institution itself. While public attention constantly drifted toward royal scandals, succession drama, and the future of the Wales family, Sophie quietly built something far more dangerous inside palace walls. Trust, real trust, the kind that could not be manufactured through publicity campaigns or carefully staged appearances. According to royal insiders, Queen Elizabeth II herself had grown deeply fond of Sophie during the final years of her reign, viewing her as one of the few senior royals who truly understood the meaning of duty without demanding recognition for it. That reputation only intensified after Charles ascended the throne. Reports suggest that during the king's increasingly difficult health battle since early 2024, Sophie's presence inside royal operations expanded dramatically. At first, the changes appeared subtle. Additional charity visits, more diplomatic receptions, increased representation at military events and Commonwealth engagements. But behind the scenes, palace administrative circles allegedly began referring to Sophie as the monarchy's safe pair of hands. While other royal figures generated instability, Sophie reportedly generated calm. One former palace aide claimed she developed a reputation for accepting responsibilities others quietly avoided. No complaints, no leaks, no attempts to outshine senior figures, just relentless consistency. And consistency within the modern monarchy had become an increasingly rare commodity. As Charles reduced public appearances during periods of treatment and recovery, insiders claim Sophie stepped into the gaps with almost surgical precision. She reportedly handled emotionally sensitive meetings involving veterans groups, diplomatic guests, and charitable organizations that required reassurance during uncertain times for the crown. According to various interpretations from royal commentators, Charles himself allegedly came to rely heavily on Sophie's judgment during moments of institutional strain. Some palace insiders even described her privately as Charles's secret weapon, a royal capable of stabilizing public confidence without attracting controversy or resentment from the public. It was a role built not on glamour, but endurance. And in many ways that made her influence even more powerful. Observers also began noticing growing comparisons between Sophie and Princess Anne. The similarities were difficult to ignore. Both women carried reputations for discipline, professionalism, and exhausting work schedules. Both appeared almost immune to public theatrics. And perhaps most importantly, both represented an older philosophy of monarchy rooted in sacrifice rather than celebrity. Royal aides reportedly admired Sophie's ability to navigate enormous pressure without creating distractions for the institution itself. Together, Edward and Sophie increasingly came to symbolize a version of royal stability that many believed the monarchy desperately needed during one of its most fragile modern chapters. But stability inside royal life has always carried an uncomfortable consequence. The more dependable a figure becomes, the more threatening their influence can appear to competing factions behind palace walls. And according to insiders, that was precisely where tensions quietly began forming. Because while Sophie's popularity with both palace staff and sections of the public steadily grew, reports suggest not everyone within the royal structure welcomed her rising importance. A notch from effervescent interpretations from royal commentators describe an atmosphere where certain advisors and household figures allegedly began feeling overshadowed by Sophie's expanding role. Some reportedly questioned whether her influence had grown beyond what Charles originally intended, Others allegedly feared the public was beginning to associate competence and reliability more strongly with Edward and Sophie than with more senior royal households. Palace whispers intensified further whenever Sophie appeared alongside William or Anne during major engagements, fueling speculation that informal alliances were slowly taking shape beneath the surface of official royal operations. What made the situation even more delicate was Sophie's refusal to engage publicly with any of the speculation surrounding her role. She gave no emotional interviews, offered no complaints, made no visible attempt to defend herself, and according to those familiar with palace culture, that silence only deepened her mystique inside the institution. Because in a monarchy increasingly defined by public narratives and media warfare, Sophie's restraint began making her appear even more formidable. And as Sophie's public approval quietly climbed, so too did speculation that powerful figures inside the palace wanted her influence carefully contained. The proposal reportedly arrived in a slim red briefing folder marked "Future Streamlining." But within palace walls, it triggered immediate alarm. Because according to insiders, King Charles's new vision for a smaller monarchy carried one explosive consequence. Sophie would allegedly lose several key positions she had spent years earning. At first glance, the plan sounded familiar. For decades, Charles had spoken openly about his desire to modernize the monarchy by reducing its size, limiting public expenditure, and concentrating official duties within a tighter inner circle of working royals. Supporters called it practical, efficient, necessary for survival in a rapidly changing Britain. But according to palace whispers now circulating through royal media circles, the newest version of that strategy carried consequences few expected. Because this time, the restructuring did not appear aimed at controversial figures or distant relatives. It reportedly targeted one of the monarchy's most dependable assets at the precise moment her influence was quietly reaching its peak. Sources familiar with internal royal discussions claim the proposed changes involved a significant reduction in Sophie's regional tours, overseas diplomatic visits, and several charitable patronages she had spent years cultivating. While no official announcement emerged publicly, reports suggest portions of her workload would allegedly be redistributed among other royal households as part of a broader operational overhaul. To outsiders, it may have looked administrative, routine. But inside palace corridors, different interpretations of the proposal describe something much colder unfolding beneath the language of modernization. Because for Edward, this was not merely a scheduling adjustment, it was a warning. According to insiders, the Duke of Edinburgh had received almost no advance indication that Sophie's role was under review before the proposal surfaced among senior aides. Several palace commentators described Edward as blindsided by the speed and secrecy surrounding the discussions. One insider reportedly claimed that key restructuring conversations had taken place within tightly controlled advisory groups long before Edward himself became aware of their implications. And that detail matters. In royal life, exclusion is rarely accidental. Silence itself can become a weapon. The absence of consultation can reveal more than any official statement ever could. At the same time, tensions surrounding the monarchy's future direction were reportedly intensifying behind closed doors. Senior advisors allegedly became divided into competing camps over how Charles should navigate the institution's next chapter, while managing both public pressure and ongoing health concerns. Some reportedly argued the monarchy needed aggressive modernization to remain financially and politically sustainable. Others feared stripping back respected working royals like Sophie would create instability at the exact moment the institution required continuity and trust. According to royal insiders, those disagreements became increasingly emotional as Sophie's public popularity continued rising in quiet but unmistakable ways. And then another layer of suspicion began surfacing. Because while Charles publicly remained the face of the restructuring effort, palace whispers increasingly questioned whether the strategy truly belonged to him alone. Reports suggest growing concern inside royal circles about the expanding influence of Queen Camilla's household and advisory network. Different interpretations from palace staff describe subtle but noticeable shifts in internal access, scheduling authority, and private consultations over recent months. Some insiders allegedly began wondering whether certain figures close to Camilla viewed Sophie's growing reputation as politically inconvenient within the delicate balance of royal influence. Those rumors only intensified as commentators began pointing out the contrast between Sophie's expanding workload and the sudden proposal to reduce her responsibilities. It made little sense to many observers. Why sideline one of the monarchy's most disciplined working royals during a period of institutional vulnerability? Why risk internal division while Charles was already under enormous physical and emotional strain? And perhaps most importantly, why did the restructuring appear to emerge so suddenly after years of Sophie being quietly relied upon behind the scenes? The deeper Edward reportedly looked into the situation, the more unsettled he became. Because according to those familiar with palace operations, he longer believed this was simply about modernization. He allegedly feared the monarchy was entering a dangerous phase where loyalty and service were becoming secondary to internal influence and private court politics. That realization transformed frustration into something far more personal, far more volatile, and within the increasingly fragile atmosphere surrounding the royal household, suspicion itself soon became enough to ignite open conflict. Yet what truly transformed concern into confrontation was the suspicion that this restructuring may not have originated with Charles himself. Whispers soon spread through Buckingham Palace corridors that another force was shaping the king's judgment behind closed doors. And according to several royal commentators, Queen Camilla's inner circle may have played a far greater role in Sophie's uncertain future than the public was ever meant to know. At the center of the growing tension was a reality the monarchy has always struggled to conceal. Royal households do not simply operate as families. They operate as competing systems of influence, competing advisors, competing priorities, competing loyalties, and according to insiders familiar with palace dynamics, the fragile balance between those internal factions had been quietly deteriorating for months. What once appeared to the public as a united royal front was reportedly becoming something far more fractured beneath the surface. Because as King Charles battled ongoing health pressures and reduced public duties, the struggle over who truly held influence around the monarch allegedly intensified behind closed doors. Different interpretations from royal commentators suggest Camilla's household had grown significantly more assertive during this period. Senior aides connected to the Queen Consort were reportedly becoming increasingly involved in discussions surrounding staffing structures, public appearances, and future royal priorities. Some insiders claim these adjustments were entirely practical, reflecting the need for greater efficiency while Charles managed his health. Others, however, allegedly viewed the shift with deep suspicion. According to palace whispers, certain members of the old royal guard quietly feared that Camilla's expanding advisory network was beginning to reshape internal hierarchy decisions in ways that favored her own influence inside the institution. And it was within that atmosphere that Sophie's name repeatedly surfaced. Because while Sophie herself avoided public controversy at all costs, her rising popularity had reportedly become impossible to ignore. Public engagement numbers surrounding her appearances remained consistently strong. Charitable organizations praised her reliability. Palace staff allegedly admired her professionalism during periods of enormous institutional strain. Even sections of the British press that once paid little attention to Edward and Sophie had begun describing them as one of the monarchy's most dependable couples. According to several media insiders, that steady rise in public admiration created discomfort in certain palace circles where influence has always depended not only on loyalty, but visibility. Some reports even suggest comparisons between Sophie and Camilla became increasingly sensitive behind the scenes. Royal commentators pointed to the contrast carefully. Sophie represented discipline, restraint, and service without spectacle. Camilla, meanwhile, remained a far more polarizing figure despite years of image rehabilitation efforts following the turbulence surrounding Princess Diana and Charles's past controversies. Though no credible source has publicly confirmed direct conflict between the two women, insiders whisper that tension surrounding their respective households had quietly simmered beneath official royal appearances for some time. And for Prince Edward, that changing atmosphere reportedly became deeply unsettling. Unlike many senior royals raised inside decades of palace maneuvering, Edward had long carried a reputation for avoiding internal warfare altogether. He rarely participated in media battles, rarely cultivated competing court alliances, rarely engaged in what one insider described as the exhausting machinery of palace politics. But according to sources familiar with his thinking, Edward allegedly began viewing the restructuring discussions around Sophie as evidence that monarchy was drifting toward precisely the kind of factional conflict he had spent his life avoiding. The idea that loyalty and years of quiet service could suddenly become vulnerable to behind-the-scenes influence reportedly struck him as both dangerous and deeply personal. Media insiders now claim signs of tension had actually been visible for months to those paying close attention. Unusual scheduling adjustments, sudden shifts in senior attendance at key engagements, reports of competing advisory meetings taking place without full household coordination. Even certain royal journalists began cautiously hinting that the balance of power within Buckingham Palace appeared increasingly unstable. But because the monarchy survives through silence, very little surfaced publicly in concrete terms. Instead, the pressure reportedly built in private conversations, cautious warnings, and nervous whispers exchanged between aides who understood just how quickly palace tensions can spiral once trust begins to collapse. And perhaps most troubling of all was the growing belief among insiders that Charles himself was becoming trapped between competing forces surrounding him. Exhausted by illness, burdened by constitutional responsibility, and increasingly dependent on advisors, the king allegedly found himself at the center of rival influences, all claiming to protect the monarchy's future. But for Edward, the situation had already crossed a line far beyond institutional disagreement, because the more he heard, the more convinced he reportedly became that Sophie here was not simply being reorganized within the system. She was being strategically diminished within it. For Prince Edward, however, this was no longer palace gossip. It had become a direct threat to his wife's legacy inside the institution they had spent decades protecting. For years, Prince Edward had mastered the art of royal silence. No scandals, no public feuds, no rebellion. But insiders now claim the Duke of Edinburgh reached a breaking point during one deeply uncomfortable private meeting where loyalty, legacy, and family collided head-on. According to multiple palace whispers, the atmosphere inside that meeting was unlike anything senior aides had witnessed from Edward in decades. This was not the reserved royal who quietly attended engagements and disappeared from headlines by the following morning. This was a man reportedly pushed beyond the limits of restraint after months of watching private discussions surrounding Sophie unfold behind closed doors. Sources familiar with the encounter describe Edward as controlled, precise, almost unnervingly calm in the way he addressed senior advisors. But beneath that calm, insiders claim there was unmistakable fury. Not loud fury. Not reckless fury. Something colder, more dangerous. The kind that builds slowly over years of loyalty, sacrifice, and silence before finally erupting when trust is broken. Reports suggest Edward directly challenged several figures connected to the restructuring proposal during the discussion, demanding explanations for why Sophie's responsibilities were allegedly being reconsidered after years of unwavering service to the crown. One insider claimed the Duke's tone remained firm but icy throughout the exchange, with long stretches of silence reportedly making the room even more uncomfortable for those present. Another source described the confrontation as emotionally shocking precisely because Edward almost never raises objections publicly within palace structures. He had spent most of his royal life adapting, compromising, and supporting the institution without demanding recognition in return. Which is why, according to those familiar with the moment, his decision to speak so forcefully carried enormous weight inside royal circles. And at the center of his anger was Sophie. Insiders claim Edward passionately defended not only her public service, but the personal sacrifices she allegedly made during one of the monarchy's most unstable modern periods. While Charles battled health concerns and public confidence in the institution faced growing strain, Sophie reportedly absorbed responsibilities far beyond what most outsiders realized. Long hours, endless travel, diplomatic obligations, charitable work requiring emotional endurance few people ever see. According to palace aides, Sophie never complained privately or publicly about the increasing demands placed upon her. She simply carried them, quietly, relentlessly. And Edward reportedly viewed any attempt to reduce or diminish her role now as an insult not only to her loyalty, but to the very principles the monarchy claims to defend. Several palace staff members were allegedly stunned by the emotional intensity beneath Edward's carefully controlled words. One insider described the atmosphere afterward as deeply shaken, with aides quietly acknowledging they had never seen the Duke so visibly affected by an internal royal matter before. because beneath the disagreement over titles and duties lay something far more painful. The growing fear that years of sacrifice could suddenly become disposable once palace priorities shifted. And perhaps most revealing of all was the reported reaction from Prince William. According to various interpretations from royal insiders, William appeared privately sympathetic to Edward's concerns throughout the growing dispute. Though careful not to openly challenge the king, sources suggest William understood the dangerous message the restructuring could send both internally and publicly. Sophie represented discipline, stability, continuity. Weakening figures like her during a period of uncertainty risked damaging morale inside an institution already stretched thin by illness, public scrutiny, and unresolved internal fractures. Some insiders even claim William quietly warned advisors that removing trusted working royals from visible positions could deepen perceptions of instability surrounding the monarchy's future. But at the center of the storm remained King Charles himself, and according to those present during portions of the discussions, the king appeared increasingly exhausted as tensions escalated around him. Sources describe Charles as conflicted, emotionally worn down, and caught between competing pressures from advisors, family members, and institutional expectations. On one side stood modernization efforts he had championed for decades. On the other stood the painful realization that those reforms were now threatening some of the monarchy's most loyal figures during one of its weakest moments. Insiders claim Charles reportedly listened more than he spoke during key parts of the confrontation, a detail many later interpreted as evidence of just how emotionally complicated the situation had become. Because by then, this was no longer simply a disagreement about staffing structures or ceremonial duties. It had become a crisis of trust unfolding inside the heart of the royal family itself. And for Edward, the implications stretched far beyond Sophie's immediate future. If loyalty, endurance, and decades of sacrifice could suddenly be pushed aside behind closed palace doors, then what exactly did duty still mean inside the modern monarchy? And behind the emotional confrontation lay an even deeper royal fear: what happens when the monarchy begins discarding its most loyal defenders? As tensions escalated, two figures reportedly stepped quietly into the unfolding crisis. Princess Anne and Prince William. One represented the monarch, wise old guard discipline. The other represented its future survival. Together, insiders claim, they began assessing whether Charles's decision could destabilize the fragile unity holding the royal institution together. According to palace whispers, the atmosphere inside senior royal circles had become increasingly fragile in the weeks following Edward's confrontation. Advisors reportedly moved carefully through internal discussions, aware that even minor disagreements now carried the potential to erupt into a much larger institutional crisis. The monarchy was already navigating enormous pressure. Charles's health struggles had created uncertainty. Public confidence remained vulnerable after years of scandals and divisions. And behind the carefully controlled public image of royal unity, insiders suggest fear was quietly spreading among those responsible for protecting the institution's long-term survival. Because if tensions between senior royals continued escalating privately, the consequences could extend far beyond family disagreements. They could strike directly at the monarchy's credibility itself. It was within that tense environment that Princess Anne reportedly became one of the first senior figures to privately support Sophie. Those familiar with palace operations have long described Anne as someone who values work above personality, discipline above image, and loyalty above politics. She is widely viewed as one of the monarchy's toughest internal figures precisely because she rarely wastes time on emotional theatrics or media games, which is why insiders claim her quiet sympathy towards Sophie carried enormous significance behind closed doors. According to various royal commentators, Anne allegedly viewed Sophie as one of the few remaining royals who genuinely understood the burdens of service without demanding constant public validation in return. Reports suggest Anne privately believed reducing Sophie's role during a period of institutional vulnerability was not only strategically risky, but morally unfair after years of dependable service. And William, according to insiders, increasingly shared those concerns. Though careful to avoid open confrontation with the king, the Prince of Wales reportedly recognized the dangerous optics surrounding the entire situation. Sophie represented professionalism, stability, and continuity qualities William himself, LF, would one day depend upon as future monarch. Sources close to palace discussions claim William deeply valued Sophie's calm approach to royal duties and viewed her as an important stabilizing figure during moments of institutional strain. More importantly, insiders suggest William understood how damaging internal fractures could become while Charles remained physically weakened and emotionally exhausted. The monarchy could survive criticism from outsiders. What it could not easily survive was the appearance of internal collapse among its own senior ranks. That fear reportedly began shaping conversations inside the palace at the highest levels. According to several media insiders, a quiet duty before politics mentality slowly emerged among senior royals and veteran advisors, alarmed by the escalating divisions. The focus allegedly shifted away from personal influence and toward institutional preservation. Because behind all the competing agendas, one terrifying reality remained unavoidable. Another public royal conflict would be catastrophic at this stage of Charles's reign. After years dominated by family betrayals, explosive interviews, memoir controversies, and public distrust, the monarchy simply could not afford another visible fracture within the House of Windsor. And so, behind closed doors, efforts reportedly intensified to contain the fallout before it spilled into the public sphere. Palace aides allegedly worked carefully to prevent leaks surrounding Edward's objections and Sophie's uncertain future. Internal scheduling became even more tightly controlled. Advisors reportedly urged restraint among competing royal households. Yet despite those efforts, insiders claimed the emotional damage inside the family was already becoming impossible to fully conceal. Because beneath every discussion about restructuring, modernization, or hierarchy lay an uncomfortable truth no one wanted to say aloud. The monarchy's future now depended heavily on a shrinking group of royals still willing to sacrifice themselves for an institution increasingly consumed by pressure and internal distrust. At the same time, reports suggest senior advisors had already begun privately discussing the long-term succession implications of the conflict. William's eventual reign loomed quietly in the background of every strategic conversation, which working royals would remain central to. By the institution's future? Which figures inspired trust among the public? Which alliances would strengthen the crown during another generational transition? These questions reportedly transformed the dispute surrounding Sophie from a temporary disagreement into something far more consequential. Because insiders increasingly feared the monarchy was not merely fighting over present responsibilities. It was unconsciously shaping the balance of power for the next era of royal rule. And perhaps that was what made the entire crisis so dangerous. Every decision now carried emotional weight far beyond its official purpose. Every private disagreement risked becoming symbolic of something larger. Loyalty versus influence, sacrifice versus survival, tradition versus control. Even Charles himself reportedly struggled to fully contain the growing tension surrounding him as competing loyalties pulled the institution in different directions at once. But by then, the damage inside the family may already have been impossible to fully undo. Remarkably, Sophie herself reportedly never raised her voice. No interviews, no public resentment, no retaliation. Yet according to those close to royal operation, her quiet reaction to the controversy may have had a far deeper impact on King Charles than any confrontation ever could. As tensions quietly consumed the upper levels of the monarchy, Sophie reportedly continued carrying out her duties with the same calm discipline that had defined her royal life for years. There were no emotional public statements, no carefully planted leaks defending her reputation, no attempts to manipulate headlines or rally sympathy through media allies. If anything, insiders claim Sophie became even more restrained as speculation surrounding her future intensified. She attended engagements, met with charities, continued supporting military organizations and Commonwealth initiatives with the same composed professionalism palace staff had come to expect from her. And according to several aides familiar with the atmosphere inside royal operations, that silence began affecting people far more deeply than anger ever could. Because while conflict often creates noise, restraint creates discomfort. Reports suggest many palace staff members found Sophie's composure emotionally devastating behind closed doors. Some insiders allegedly described an atmosphere of wing guilt among aides who had witnessed her increasing workload during Charles's illness, while simultaneously hearing whispers that her role might soon be diminished. One longtime royal employee reportedly observed that Sophie never once spoke bitterly about the restructuring discussions, even privately. Instead, she allegedly continued focusing on the institution itself, determined not to deepen tensions already threatening the monarchy from within. That level of self-control only strengthened comparisons many inside the palace had quietly begun making for months. Comparisons to Queen Elizabeth II. According to several royal commentators, Sophie's response to the crisis reminded many senior staff of the late Queen's deeply disciplined approach to duty during periods of personal turmoil. Elizabeth rarely allowed emotional conflict to disrupt public responsibility, even during some of the monarchy's darkest modern chapters. And insiders now claim Sophie displayed a strikingly similar instinct for endurance. Calm under pressure, silent under criticism. Focused entirely on preserving institutional stability, even while personally wounded by events unfolding around her. In many ways, hat resemblance reportedly became impossible for senior royals to ignore, especially Charles. Sources close to palace discussions claimed the king became increasingly deeply affected as tensions surrounding Sophie continued escalating internally. Unlike the harsher political maneuvering reportedly unfolding among certain households and advisory circles, Sophie's silence forced the emotional reality of the situation directly into focus. This was not a rebellious royal challenging the crown, not a scandal figure creating instability. This was someone who had loyally supported the monarchy through years of crisis, now quietly absorbing uncertainty without complaint. According to insiders, Charles allegedly struggled emotionally with the growing realization that one of the institution's most dependable figures had become trapped inside a battle she never sought. At the same time, public sympathy for Sophie reportedly began growing in subtle but noticeable ways online. Royal watchers increasingly praised her composure, work ethic, and refusal to engage in public drama despite mounting speculation surrounding her future. Social media discussions began portraying Sophie and Edward as symbol. Miassy lack of loyalty being overlooked within an institution consumed by internal politics and competing agendas. While palace officials reportedly attempted to suppress further speculation, insiders claimed the growing emotional support for Sophie only intensified anxieties behind closed doors. Because public perception matters deeply to the monarchy, especially during periods of uncertainty surrounding succession, leadership, and institutional stability. And beneath all of it, a darker fear reportedly began spreading through royal households themselves. According to several media insiders, morale among palace staff had already become dangerously fragile following years of scandals, public criticism, and internal tensions. But the situation surrounding Sophie allegedly created a different kind of anxiety altogether. If someone so disciplined, loyal, and respected could suddenly face quiet marginalization after decades of service, then what security did anyone inside the institution truly have? Staff members reportedly began worrying that trust itself was eroding within the royal structure. Not publicly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, in ways that could eventually become impossible to repair. Because institutions rarely collapse all at once. They weaken gradually through exhaustion, uncertainty, and the silent deterioration of faith among the people expected to protect them. And according to those closest to palace operations, that realization had started haunting even the monarchy's most experienced figures. The arguments were no longer simply about roles, appearances, or hierarchy. They had evolved into something much more painful. A growing question over whether loyalty still held value inside the modern House of Windsor. And as the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, one unavoidable reality began settling over the monarchy. In the end, this was never merely about titles, schedules, or ceremonial duties. It was about something far more dangerous for the House of Windsor. The quiet erosion of trust between the very people tasked with protecting the crown during one of the monarchy's most vulnerable eras. Behind the palace gates, beyond the carefully rehearsed appearances and controlled public statements, insiders suggest the monarchy has entered a period of emotional exhaustion unlike anything seen in decades. King Charles, once determined to modernize the institution with clarity and confidence, now reportedly finds himself increasingly isolated by illness, pressure, and the crushing reality of competing loyalties surrounding him. According to those familiar with royal operations, the burden of the crown has become heavier with every passing month, not simply because of constitutional responsibility or public scrutiny, but because the very people Charles once depended upon now appear caught in an atmosphere of uncertainty and mistrust. And perhaps nowhere has that tension become more visible than in the growing crisis surrounding Edward and Sophie. For years, they represented the monarchy's safest foundation: quiet, reliable, unshakably loyal. While headlines focused on scandals, betrayals, and public controversy, Edward and Sophie continued carrying out thousands of engagements without demanding praise or attention. They became symbols of stability during periods when the institution desperately needed calm. And yet, according to palace whispers, their loyalty may have unintentionally exposed one of the monarchy's deepest modern fears. What happens when duty alone is no longer enough to protect your place within the system? Becca. At the center of this entire conflict lies a painful contradiction the House of Windsor still struggles to resolve. The monarchy wants modernization, but it also depends upon tradition. It wants efficiency, but it survives through symbolism. It wants a smaller royal structure, yet continues relying heavily on the very figures now rumored to be facing reduced influence. That contradiction reportedly created enormous strain behind palace walls as Charles's long-promised vision for a slimmed-down monarchy collided with the emotional realities of loyalty, sacrifice, and institutional survival. And over time, the debate stopped feeling strategic. It became personal. According to several royal commentators, the restructuring discussions surrounding Sophie touched a nerve far deeper than anyone initially anticipated because they symbolized something larger than one royal role. They represented the fear that decades of service could quietly become disposable once political priorities shifted inside the institution. Public scrutiny only intensified those concerns. Online discussions increasingly focused on whether loyal working royals were being undervalued while palace factions compete. ID for influence behind closed doors. Every appearance, every scheduling decision, every carefully worded statement suddenly carried new meaning as observers searched for signs of growing division within the family itself. Meanwhile, the shadow of Queen Elizabeth II reportedly continued hanging over every major decision being made inside Buckingham Palace. Her legacy remains impossible to escape. According to palace insiders, many senior royals still privately measure modern leadership against the late Queen's extraordinary sense of stability and endurance. Elizabeth represented continuity during chaos, discipline during scandal, calm during emotional storms that might have shattered weaker institutions entirely. And in moments like this, insiders claim comparisons to her reign become almost unavoidable. Some reportedly wonder whether the late Queen would have allowed such tensions to deepen unchecked within the family. Others believe the monarchy she built was always destined to face this exact crisis, once the delicate balance she maintained disappeared. Because beneath all the ceremonial traditions and public grandeur, the monarchy remains something profoundly human, a family car, yang impossible expectations while trapped inside an institution older than any individual within it. And when illness, pressure, ambition, and emotional exhaustion begin colliding at the highest levels of that institution, even silence can become dangerous. Even loyalty can begin feeling fragile. Now, according to those closest to royal operations, the greatest fear inside palace walls is no longer simply public scandal. It is internal disillusionment, the slow weakening of trust among the very people responsible for protecting the crown through its most uncertain modern chapter. Because once faith inside the institution itself begins eroding, the consequences become far more difficult to contain than any newspaper headline or royal controversy. Because within the House of Windsor, insiders whisper that power is rarely lost through revolution, it disappears slowly, through silence, exhaustion, and the breaking of trust between family and duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.